Hello everyone, I am Lu from ACT Next. I appreciate this opportunity to be able to present our paper at this online LAC conference. The organizers have done a great job of making this happen, for which we feel very grateful. We, as a distributed team, consist of Alejandro and me in the United States, Rosa, Hita, and Arthur in the Netherlands, and many other collaborators who contribute to the project at different stages. As with this online conference, technology enables us to collaborate despite distances and diverse expertise. It not only helps us conquer the coronavirus, but also brings new challenges and opportunities in our journey of understanding learning. In our paper, we try to address the problem of finding meaningful information from noisy high-frequency time series data. In particular, we used a cluster-based regime switching dynamic model to understand embodied mathematical learning. My presentation unfolds from the introduction to the method, results, and discussion. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat box, if any. The learning environment we investigated is an embodied learning platform. Embodied learning builds on the theories of embodied cognition, which argues that abstract concepts emerge from physical experiences with the environment. Thus, learning is a process of dynamically coordinating modalities that lead to representations or conceptualizations of the world. Technological advances, such as the development of touchscreens and virtual reality, transform our traditional ways of interacting with intelligent tools. Nowadays, through various sensors, we can quickly obtain tons of objective multimodal data as they occur naturally. This helps solve problems such as subjectivity and high demand for human labor associated with qualitative approaches. However, the massive amount of data, if not analyzed properly, can put a heavy burden on computation and can be too noisy to hide the underlying change mechanisms. The chart on this slide presents the types of variability often seen in the human time series data. Quantitative variability refers to the within subject numerical changes, potentially with process noise, and between subject random effects in measurement. In contrast, qualitative variability refers to the within subject regime or phase transitions and between subject group differences or clusters. Mathematically, the quantitative variability is often accommodated in continuous variables, while the qualitative variability in categorical variables. A regime is a time-varying class of a subject that may switch from one to another as time passes. It is a broader concept than a phase, which is considered as the courses in one-directional and often non-reversible class transitions, such as age-based developmental phases. Dynamic processes may exhibit group-wise quantitative changes interspersed with qualitative regime switching. Then we need to address the old philosophical question: how can we identify qualitative changes from quantitative changes as seen in this high-frequency time series data? The embodied learning platform we considered is called the Mathematical Imagery Trainer and Proportion. Its recent version uses a touchscreen tablet to help students explore the concept of proportion physically. The tablet displays two vertical bars whose heights are controlled by fingers. The bars change color from red to green anytime they achieve a correct ratio, say 1/2, which is initially unknown to the student. During an interview, the students needs to find this hidden rule that makes the bar spring. They move their bars up and down and observe how the color changes. After they find the first grain, they need to keep the bars green all the time while moving them. As students freely explore these different configurations, a tutor coaches them to reflect upon the activity. Previous studies found patterns and strategies used in students' action coordination that relate to Piaget's phases of reflective abstraction. Here, the hand movement patterns are within the subject quantitative variability, the sequence of specific solution strategies used, or the abstraction phases in which a subject is situated are qualitative switching regimes. We are interested in understanding what strategies distinguish high-performing from low-performing students. Hence, we not only want to discover distinct regimes in student strategy use or knowledge development, but also we want to characterize group patterns across students in which regime transitions. That is, we aim to quantitatively analyze the data collected in interviews to uncover the presence of regimes in student sequences of behaviors and to understand whether there are patterns of regime transitions across students that are otherwise difficult to detect using a qualitative analysis. To sum up, our research questions include number 1, are there distinct hand movement regimes and regime transitions in students' learning processes? Number 2, what properties do the regimes have? Number 3, are there clusters of students who share similar patterns of regime switching learning processes? Number 4, what do these regimes and clusters reveal about mathematical learning? To answer these questions, we conducted secondary data analysis. We had data from 37 9 to 11-year-old students who participated in task-based semi-structured interviews in the Netherlands. For this study, we only focused on hand movement and conversation data collected in the task. The average time spent on this task was 7.3 minutes. As a first step, we cleaned and processed the massive data. For instance, we rescaled the time for each individual such that everyone has the same time frame. We aggregated data at 200 equally spaced time points and computed ratios between right and left-hand positions as our observed variable. The proportion of missing data has a median of 0.05 across students. We imputed the missing data with linear interpolation. These data manipulations were needed to adapt the method of our interest to typical human process data in education, social, and behavioral sciences. Most manipulation decisions were based on the results of multicolor simulations, where we examined how different factors such as the number of people, number of time points, and proportion of missingness alter the accuracy of parameter estimates and classifications in fitting the model. Thus, we are confident in our analytic results. We mathematically represented the time series data of hand ratios using the mixture regime switching hidden logistic transition process model, mixRHLP for short. Although some time series methods allow for the modeling of quantitative within-subject changes, most of these methods do not simultaneously account for possible group differences across students and phase transitions over time. That's why we need this more sophisticated model to analyze both quantitative and qualitative variability. There are 4 major components in this model. A mixture model for clustering, a mixture model for regimes at each time point, a polynomial regression model for the time trend, and a logistic regime transition model. Mixture models assume that the variable distributions follow a mixture distribution, whose densities is the weighted sum of component densities associated with each latent categorical variable, either a cluster or a regime. Say we have NP people and NT time points. If we assume that there are K latent cluster class Z and R latent regimes H, then the distribution of our sample Y is captured by 2 mixture distributions in equation 1 and 2, with the probability of being in each latent class as a weight. Further, regressions on the time variable were used to describe the dynamics in each regime and the regime transition process. More specifically, the dynamic patterns in each regime are characterized by polynomial regressions on time t, with x as the design matrix and beta as the regression coefficients. And the probabilities of being in a certain regime at time t is a multinomial regression on time t. Please note that in this regime transition model, the change is one directional as the probability function is monotonic. Since we can write the log likelihood function of theta given all available data, y, we can estimate the parameters in the model using maximum likelihood approaches, such as the EN algorithm. We fitted the statistical model using the R package mixRHLP with different values of the numbers of clusters, the number of regimes, and the order of polynomial regressions. Among all 32 models we considered, we chose the simpler model in the list of models with the smallest 3 VIC values. The selected model consisted of 2 clusters, 3 regimes, and linear regressions. Again, the choice of using BIC as the selection criterion was also tested in simulations. It was shown to be a more effective and accurate tool in model selection compared to other model fitting criteria such as AIC and sample-adjusted BIC. The parameter estimates from fitting the chosen model to the data are summarized in this table. In regime 1, the regression intercepts were near 1 with very small error variances, indicating the hands were moving at the same height. In regime 2, the intercepts were still around 1, but the error variances were larger, indicating hands moving with noticeable variability. In regime 3, the intercepts were about 2 with small error variances, suggesting hands moving at the desired ratio of 1/2 to keep the bars green. So actually, regime 1 corresponds to an initial phase of the embodied interaction. Regime 2 corresponds to an intermediate phase of the interaction. During regime 2, the students was actively exploring different hands ratios, and then they might deploy a mixture of strategies where 2 hands move independently or move at fixed distances. Regime 3 corresponds to a later phase of interaction. During this phase, the hands maintained at a 1/2 ratio. Note To keep the same ratio as the hands move up, one hand has to move twice as fast as the other hand. It is challenging to students even though they've figured out the proportional rule. As the tutor asks the students to find green in as many ways as possible, from time to time, the students fell back into regime 2 and more exploration phase. So both the regimes 2 and 3 were indicative of important cognitive activities. The probability of an individual being in cluster 1 was estimated to be 0.42, a little smaller than that of being in cluster 2. Here are some figures that help illustrate our findings. The top figures show two characteristic phase transitions that are representative of these two clusters. One for participant 75 and then the other for participant 83, who displays different hand movement dynamics but were randomly chosen for illustration. Participant 75, classified in cluster 1, spent a substantial amount of time exploring various ratios or only moving their hands at the same speed. Participant 83, classified in cluster 2, spent only 10% of the time moving hands at the same heights and quickly switched to a 1:2 ratio phase, interspersed with chunks of short explorations. The bottom figures illustrate the estimated expected logistic curves of the probabilities of being in the regime. In cluster 1, regime 1, probability was the highest at the start, but quickly surpassed by regime 2 probability. Regime 3 became the highest at around 70% into the interview session. In cluster 2, regime 1 was the highest until approximately 10% of the interview when regime 2 took the lead. Then regime 3 became the most probable state at about 20% into the session, much sooner compared to cluster 1. Indeed, what the logistic curves tells us is that the student in cluster 1 has about the same likelihood to find the rule than not to find it, as indicated by the high logistic curve of regime 2 for most of the task segments. Instead, students in cluster 2 have a much higher probability of finding the proportional rule, especially after the first half. It is apparent that in cluster 2, the probability of being in regime 1 goes down quickly and almost disappears after the first quarter. On the other hand, the probability of regime 2 goes down but still lingers on until the end of the task. As a follow-up analysis, we transcribed the audio data and produced English translations of the Dutch conversations using Google Translate, which were then checked for clarity by one of the co-authors. Then we analyzed the talk patterns by looking at the distribution of the words and then the most frequent n-grams in each regime. An n-gram analysis consists of running a sliding window of size n through the text and extracting the sequences of words within that window. Specifically, we look at sequences of 3, 4, and 5 words, and then sorted the sequences in descending order of counts to find out the most frequent n-grams in each regime. Results show that the content of the talk was different between regimes, as illustrated by this table. In regime 1, most of the students' talk was descriptive, while the tutor introduced the task. In regime 2, when there was much more exploration, students' talk often depicts confusion, such as "I do not know," while the tutor prompts inquiry and reflection by "What do you mean? Can you show that?" In regime 3, where the hands achieved a 1-to-2 ratio, the students explained possible reasons, while the tutor encouraged them to further explore and find a global rule of or a movement. In summary, in this study, we conducted a statistical analysis of the hands ratio and discovered qualitative differences during the activity and across students. We characterized the between subjects variation as clusters and the within subject changes as regimes. In different regimes, we identify interesting patterns of hand movements. Moreover, we identified two distinct clusters of students with characteristic phase transitions of hand movement patterns that can be associated with slow and quick learners. Furthermore, we found that there are different characteristics of student-tutor verbal communication during different learning phases. However, our cluster-based regime switching analysis has limitations. First, our analysis only took into account the hands ratio, but there are other hand movement variables such as speed and distance between hands that we could have utilized. Second, we constrained the analysis to hand logs, but we can further explore the addition of hand eye gaze data and study how hand and eye movements coordinate in such activities. Third, we made specific assumptions about how the regime transitions, which needs further exploration. So, potential further extensions of the current study include the development of more efficient estimation techniques for multivariate mixRHLP model, and including other models for comparison. We also anticipate some applications. For instance, in collaborative learning environments such as classrooms, we might be able to monitor students' real-time behavior and utilize the technique illustrated here to assign students into different clusters and make model-based predictions of their behavior. These analytic results would benefit educators and education designers who want to tailor instructions to the specific needs of groups of students or want to shift students from one cluster to another. A lot of exciting work to be done. In the end, I want to thank my supervisors and colleagues in the ACT Next group and my collaborators in Utrecht and at Berkeley again. To all of you here, thank you for your time and attention.